The Goldenrod Protocols by James Oliver, copyright 2023.
His veins felt hot as the blood inside them pumped faster. The fantasy tingled in his groin as it blossomed into an intention. He felt bold and defiant, like a teenager sneaking out past curfew. He could own his life, like he always wanted, if only for one fleeting evening. Tom was right. He needed a vacation, not just from the gritty, confining walls around him or from town square, but from himself. He could go anywhere, maybe even somewhere he wasn't supposed to go. "I'm leaving." He shoved his link in the rusty desk drawer and slid into the hallway. It was his ascension to a new subversion, a real rebellion. He'd uncover an inner truth, not the janky truth wafting through the rotten air he breathed. He quietly descended the stairs to the factory floor and took a slow lap around the trainees so he seemed like he was checking on them. He tried not to look over his shoulder while he headed for the door, but couldn't help it. He passed the lockers in the hallway and pushed through the exit. He trotted across the plaza and up the stairs to the shuttle platform, arriving just as it was touching down. He boarded the shuttle, bursting with anticipation. "I'm going to be free." Chapter 3. This stop, Lenape Square. "It's not too late," Jack told himself over the heartbeat in his ears. "You can catch the next shuttle back to work." "No," he insisted. He refused to be remanded to a cage this time, consequences be damned. He was dancing with damnation, but his link and its spying eye were tucked away in his desk drawer. A checkmon scuttled to the door and stood next to him. His eyes were shiny and bloodshot. He was jittery, like he was jonesing for a fix. He was short, young, and thin. His fledgling beard clung to his cheeks, afraid to step forward and be judged. He was standing as straight and tall as his spine would allow. His spindly fingers cradled his link while he browsed town square. He was full of energy, but might have fallen over if Jack had blown in his direction. The glint from the reddening sunlight in his thick-rimmed glasses was more than simple physics. It was a badge of righteousness bestowed upon him by the Abbeys. The Mon's wandering eyes briefly locked with Jack's before darting back to the screen in his hand. Checks often watched without looking. Eye contact could call attention. Attention may lead to conversation, which might mean exposure. Exposure would mean judgment. Judgment might mean erasure. If they didn't look, they couldn't be seen. But this was no ordinary Mon. Jack could tell by his red watchband in lieu of a bracelet that he was a Czech of the highest caliber. Such a golden boy, he accessorized his bracelet. Jack had met many men like this before. Wait for it. He took quick stock of Jack from top to bottom. Short-cropped hair, 2 days' worth of beard stubble, an Oxford cloth shirt unbuttoned at the top, with a collar to boot. It was white, not an earthy brown or green. Sleeves rolled up under the elbow to free his wrists from his cuffs. None of these things were cause for concern by themselves, but Jack's simple, pragmatic fashion choices, jeans in solid color or simple plaid button-ups in mild or cool weather, chinos and striped, collared, short-sleeved shirts in the summer, painted the portrait of a man who preferred the timeless to the trendy. Trends were rich, complex, constantly updating codes the most devout Czechs used to tell each other from the infidels. Those most tuned to the evolving tenets of devotion could anticipate and adapt to the changes in real time, while those less worthy of grace struggled to keep up. Bucking the trends to move them forward made you a revolutionary. Rejecting them for tradition made you a hazard. By Abbey decree, preference for tradition, even by default, was a dead giveaway that you didn't really believe. The Mon's eyes felt dirty on Jack's skin as they watched him. He turned to the window for a brief respite in the quaint little village beyond the green zone that the Abbeys forgot. He held the handlebar above the door so tightly his palm began to hurt. "I'm Nicholas Blanchard," he offered without request, pressing his palm against his chest to expose his watch. "B217. Nicholas, never Nick. Pet names implied superiority. Calling him Nick would be an act of violence used to assert and affirm dominance. Jack's heart pounded behind his shirt. His breath shortened. His skin chilled. This was a Czech ritual. His privacy was about to be violated, but he had to play along. If he pretended he hadn't heard the question, Nicholas would ask again. If he gave a fake name, Nicholas wouldn't be able to find him. He would grow suspicious, gradually raising his voice to call everyone's attention as he confirmed the spelling. Eventually, Jack would be called out for evasion. He was trapped. "Jack Caulder," he replied, rubbing his earlobe with his left hand. He was supposed to mirror Nicholas's hand gesture, but he'd be all right as long as he showed his bracelet. It was the only rebellion he could get away with. K9184. Nicholas searched Town Square for Jack's devotion quotient. It would be listed near the top of his persona. Jack stood still like he often did as a child while his parents read a bad report card. Your devotion quotient was calculated by dividing your average number of Town Square posts and comments per year by the product of the average checks you receive and the average ratio of checks to X's, which produced the origination factor. Then the average ratio of checks to X's on posts and comments you checked was divided by the reciprocal of the check to X ratio of posts and comments you X'd, the affirmation factor, and added to the origination factor. The sum was then divided by your age minus 16, subtracted by 1, multiplied by 10, and rounded to the nearest whole number. Your DQ, or devotion, was a standardized way to measure your devotion, social clout, and your worth to other people. A low DQ could cost you a bank loan, convenience privileges like delivery services or RAD hails, and even patronage in certain businesses. For some kinds of purchases, it determined your rations, or precluded them altogether. A sudden drop in your DQ could cost you a job. Tenure be damned. Those were the big things that only came up once in a while and could be worked around with minimal effort and sacrifice. It was the little things that he had to deal with every day that filled Jack with such rage he lost touch with himself. His low DQ meant he was prohibited from renting a car. He could only get to wherever he wanted to go on someone else's schedule, at someone else's mercy, and never directly. He was less free to roam his planet than those who worked harder for mobility than anyone should have to. He was trapped. His movements were dictated by forces beyond his control or comprehension. The DQ was a measure of your humanity, boiled down to a simple formula with 3 inputs. Someone like Nicholas probably had a DQ north of 500. Jack's was a single digit. He did the math once and realized that each year you either had to post and comment more or generate more and more checks just to maintain the same score over time. But Town Square didn't tell you that. He watched Nicholas's thumb swiping up, and then he drew his link closer to his face. He found me, Jack knew. Nicholas winced. Jack's devotion did not meet with his approval. Jack was tainted, toxic. Jack had nothing to offer him, and there could be no benefit to any further interaction, only risk. Jack was relieved when the shuttle touched down, but his mood soured when, just before Nicholas bolted off the shuttle, he turned to say with disgust thinly veiled by cursory politeness, "Welcome to Lenape Square, be tame." Jack followed him onto the platform with slow, uncertain steps toward the edge. Was this a bad idea? He'd finally get to walk this pristine city's streets, but he'd be on the outside looking in and no one would be fooled. He leaned over the guardrail to see the city and breathed deep to feel its vibrance. The sights and sounds reinvigorated him. He was ready for whatever came next. He stepped onto the glass elevator and watched the wonders approach from below. He felt godlike as he descended toward the Golden City. When he reached the ground, he stepped onto a shale plaza surrounded by a circular park peppered by checks, doing just what Jack assumed checks did in a place like this. Couples picnicked on the grass. A young woman leaned against a tree reading a book. A yogi shared her wisdom with a crowd of Zen seekers pushing their bodies and spirits to the limit on mats in front of her. A group of students sat on the grass trading abstract ideas. And across the traffic orbiting the park, people watched from their sidewalk cafes and hookah lounges. Above them stood office and apartment towers, rising to a crescendo of 2 magnificent towers standing on the shoulders of the grand avenue where it met the road around the park. The structures, the people, and the park were perfectly crafted monuments to devotion and all its perks. He started down the path to the road, which was lined with young trees and uniquely ornate and whimsical streetlights. He stopped at a wayfinding sign and found the "You Are Here" dot in the park, close to a bold white ring surrounding it labeled Grand Rotary. There were only a few roads in the whole town. Most of the paths between the buildings were either nondescript access alleys, for garbage trucks, he guessed, or wide, light green pedestrian thoroughfares with names like Second St. Plaza and Crosstown Concourse. Only 2 car-friendly roads split off Grand Rotary, one to the north and another to the south. The southern one split again into 2 roads to feed traffic into the outlying areas of town. The east-west walkways all stopped at Front Street Walk, a pedestrian corridor running vertically behind the buildings he saw across the street. The only direct route west was Nanticoke Boulevard, the third and final car-friendly road connecting to Grand Rotary, just above the dot on the map. He couldn't find a road from Lenape Square to the Legacy Town, but then whoever created the sign wouldn't have included it. He leaned around the sign to see the major intersection not 50 yards north of where he stood. He traced the boulevard through a cluster of yellow blocks and dark green strips labeled Lifestyle District, after which it broke its rigid straightness and gave way to pure geometric arcs until it abruptly ended at Lenny Greenway. West of the curved green strip, where the Legacy Town should have been, there was only the sign's deep background gray. He remembered his father's map. Here be dragons. He trotted across the street as soon as there was a break in the traffic. He couldn't see the boulevard between the towers from here, but it only made the gateway beckoning newcomers that much more tantalizing. He almost tripped on his way to the intersection because couldn't help but gaze at the tops of the towers poking into the heavens. But his wild imagination barely missed a step as it anticipated the wonders waiting around the corner. He remembered all the views he'd caught of the tall, shimmering towers from the shuttle. The fine cuisine and high culture beyond the downtown towers would have to wait for now, but even walking among the rustic stucco and Gothic stone would hold him over. Part of him wanted to savor the anticipation, but the other knew he'd waited long enough. But the first glimpse he caught of Nanticoke Boulevard when he rounded the corner wasn't what he'd expected. There was no rustic stucco or mossy Gothic stone beyond the road junction. The tallest buildings were half the height of the towers around Grand Rotary, 9 or 10 stories at most. He saw garish logos for clothing shops like Fitton and dozens of others, none of them unfamiliar. Czechs could have their clothing delivered, but then no one would see them carrying the bags or parking their luxury cars along the curb. He saw the same restaurants and bars he knew from Wilmington. Their unique, recognizable style was molded in wood and steel and plastic over cheap veneers, pretending to be authentic and gritty. Every trace of color that drew his eye somehow seemed grayer than the last once he actually looked at it. He backed up a few paces to take another look at the park across the Rotary and noticed things he hadn't the first time. A passerby took pictures of the young woman reading her book, and she kept opening it to different pages for each shot. Most of the yogi's students snapped photos of themselves drinking water, patting their foreheads with a towel or downward dogging with selfie sticks and drones. The group of students stared silently into their palms, their faces glowing not by the living light of new ideas, but by the chilling light of their links. Dozens of steel poles topped with high-fidelity 360-degree cameras recorded the surroundings. A digital version would be rendered in 2.0 PIA, so hundreds of people all over town could be there but from the confines of their living rooms. All of it was choreographed like something from the moments of appreciation the Abbeys played during commercials to convince you that your life was optimal. None of these people are doing these things because they wanted to. They were doing them because they thought they should, because they thought others wanted to do them. This was a place to be seen, to see too, but only reciprocally, and to get ideas for the next thing you should be seen doing. It was a place to tell yourself you were living the best life. Not your best life necessarily, but someone's version of it. The evening chill blew across the park as the sun dipped behind the towers. He was disappointed and a little embarrassed to have been surprised, but this was always just a stop along the way to somewhere better. He resumed his trek down Nanticoke Boulevard, trying to shake the nagging suspicion that there may be no difference between happiness and the illusion of it. A few cars crawled along the single lanes in each direction, never gaining much speed and often slowing to cross the raised crosswalks, running between planters with azaleas and cypress trees. The video boards above the storefronts washed the sidewalk activity below in an unsettling red. The profiles and town square avatars of the damned cycled across their screens with a proclamation of their misdeeds and the consequences they'd suffer. Their shame was everywhere. They couldn't escape their judgment, and the still compliant couldn't miss the threat. And there were never any details about their crimes, only labels. Traditionalist, sympathizer, hate-monger, heterodoxer. They were mostly Czechs, but here and there a Prague would appear. No one is safe. He heard his own voice begging him to run back to safety. "No," commanded the same voice from somewhere stronger inside. "You've come this far." He took a peek down Front Street Walk when he got to the corner. He was underwhelmed by the simple stone benches and wooden planters with ferns and ficus shrubs. Most pedestrians walked close to the storefronts, leaving the middle largely unused. The lifestyle district wasn't really any different from the Christiana Mall his mother used to take him to, save for the open sky. On the corner across Front Street Walk sat a boxy structure wrapped in synthetic brick and covered in video boards. Atop the building sat a two-sided billboard more permanent than the ads running around the walls. On one side was a screen running a gifage, profound and affirming message cleverly woven into a 5 to 10-second graphic by Class B24 master artists and played on a loop. It depicted the depraved Allegiant congresspersons fighting over the flag of the Great Republic and tearing it to pieces. Above them was the Ouroboros, the symbol of the devoted and the better way. It depicted the perpetual cycle of self-evaluation and the destruction of the most toxic, rancid parts of you. Out with the old and in with the new. The Ouroboros descended from the sky, surrounded by a beaming white light that dissolved the allegiance and stitched the flag back together. Next to this was an ad for Eastern Central Abbey, its slogan, "Learn Your Truth," in brightly lit gold block letters against a black background. The Y in your flickered, as if the golden facade of this check haven was beginning to crack. "Please don't do this." A frantic and scared young woman sat with 3 others at a patio table beside a cafe with "Yum" carved out of a steel ribbon above the windows and doors. "No, you don't speak now," was the cold reply from the man sitting across from her. "I'm begging you, Kevin. Please. It was a joke," she pleaded. "No, Samantha, it was a threat," Kevin scolded. "None of us are safe around you." Jack couldn't tell if it was remorse or contempt he saw in Kevin's eyes as he stood and held up his link, preparing to record her. Samantha trembled and cried into her hands. "Kevin," she wept. "Please, I'm your best friend." "You were never my friend, Samantha, because I don't keep undevoted friends. The person I believed I knew was a lie." Samantha was about to undergo deconstruction, the ceremonial undoing of every fiber she'd stitched together to create the tapestry of who she was. Her values, her relationships, her actions, and her words, her entire history, would be superficially scrutinized and then disregarded. Everything she'd come to think of as who and what she was about to be destroyed. All the devoted good she'd done in her life up to now had lost all meaning. One misstep was enough to awaken the monster sleeping behind the friendly faces of her closest companions. The specter of deconstruction stalked every check, and never very far behind. It was the halfway certain death of the righteous persona they'd carefully constructed for everyone else to see for as long as any of them could remember. Far more terrifying than slipping into oblivion when their bodies finally succumbed to time. There was no hope for her, and no choice for Kevin. They were in public. Someone would have felt threatened by her comment even if he hadn't. Feelings reached beyond the heart and mind of the person feeling them, across space and backward through time, and reconstituted the fabric of the world to fit them. Feelings were the fundamental reality. The way a person felt about something became the objective truth of it. If he didn't expose her, someone else would, and then expose him for being complicit. He had to sacrifice her to save himself and everyone around him. Even in her anguish, some part of her probably understood. And so, just like that, a lifelong friendship would be erased from history. No matter how perfect her contrition, it wouldn't save her. This wasn't the first time Jack had seen deconstruction up close. It would be painful to watch, and it wasn't safe for onlookers. Everyone's senses would be heightened. Someone in the crowd would turn on the others before someone else had the chance. It was a cascading failure of humanity, and bystanders were usually caught in the crossfire. But he couldn't run. It would draw suspicion. He took small comfort knowing that even the true believers there would be as terrified as he was. He was careful not to hurry but not linger. He reached for his link. Shit, he remembered, it's in my desk. He searched desperately for a distraction. Something, anything else to look at. A few doors down from Yum, he found a mannequin in a window adorned in the newest trends. "What did you say, Sam?" he heard Kevin ask from over his shoulder. Sam. Not Samantha. Her name was the first thing to be taken from her. "What did you say?" It wouldn't be much longer before she submitted to her fate. The longer this went on, the more shame she'd suffer. She'd give in sooner or later, whenever she accepted the futility of pleading. Jack tilted his head just enough that if he strained his eyes, he could see the commotion. Samantha begged for mercy, but the harder she begged, the louder they ignored her. The diners around her table had stood and found their spots around her to shout their lines. "What did you say?" Their performance was elegantly dualistic. They were there to add pressure on Samantha. But some of them hadn't heard what she said. They needed to know so they could be as angry with her as they were supposed to be. He carefully repositioned himself to see a little more. Samantha's groveling was ineffably graceful. Her swaying, her hand gestures, and the cadence of her wailing synchronized with those of her accusers in a perfectly choreographed marionette ballet. But no matter how perfect her dance, it would never save her.